And if you could go still back in time to the Greco-Roman world and maybe to Mesopotamia, which we mentioned before, wouldn't it be wonderful to kind of trace this outsketch of a global history of ideas?
How did the Greco-Romans influence the Indians? What literary evidence can be found of this cultural influence? And did it ever go the other way? Hello, my name is Anya Leonard, and you are listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks, a podcast dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds. Today's podcast is with Roberto Morales, Associate Professor of Sanskrit and Head of the Department of Classical Philology at the University of Costa Rica. But before we delve into the literary and archaeological evidence of ancient cultural exchanges, I'd like to say thank you to our Classical Wisdom members who make this podcast possible. If you would like to learn more about classical wisdom, including our free newsletter, please go to classicalwisdom.substack.com and check it out. So Roberto, thank you so much for joining me today. You've written a very interesting book called The Embassy, the Ambush, and the Ogre, Greco-Roman Influence in Sanskrit Theater, which is sort of bringing these sort of two worlds together. But I think it's really good to start always with the premise, which is, can literary parallelisms prove cultural contact, or can different cultures hap upon similar discoveries?
Hi, Anya. Thanks for having me on your wonderful podcast. And sure, let's talk a little bit about the book and its proposal. I usually like to think of this in practical terms. So let me begin with a very quick story. When you look at a classic text like the Iliad, for instance, and you think about it in broad terms, so it's the story about a war. You have two sides, you have kings and heroes. Maybe this is such an universal topic that it can appear almost everywhere else in human history. But when you look at the specifics, things tend to get more interesting. So, for instance, when you look at Achilles and simultaneously you look at a Sanskrit hero called Bhishma, they are both sons of goddesses. They were both born from a goddess and a human male. Their presence or absence in the battle determines whether their side will win or lose. Their births both resulted from divine conflicts. Both goddesses relate to water, so we're thinking about Tethys and Ganga in India. There is this other like side story about a killing of their siblings, and they are the only ones remaining alive. There is also this story about some feature making them immortal or considering them some sort of partial immortality, which has also its downs. In the case of Achilles, people might remember his heel, but there is also something to it in this character named Bhishma. There is also the fact that they are both unmarried, but their relationships with other women are relevant to the plot of their stories. They are the best warriors in their respective sides. They both withdraw from battle, and the similarities just keep on piling on. There is this wonderful book called The Mahabharata and Greek Mythology by a Spanish historian called Fernando Wolf Alonso, and he finds 126 parallelisms between these two narratives. So when you look at it in these terms, yes, you can never exclude completely exclude the possibility of just luck, coincidence, but in my opinion, it's much more likely that if a couple of things resemble each other, it could be a lucky coincidence. But if you have hundreds of them, then there might be another side to it, another explanation. There is this other book which I also like to bring to the table when I'm discussing these subjects, and it is called Odysseus and Arjuna by a British anthropologist called Nicholas Allen. He compares these two characters, and he also finds lots of similarities between them. They are both the protagonists in their stories. They are both married and begin a journey which means leaving their wives behind and eventually get together with their wives again. And they both have four significant encounters with other females during this journey. So there is this even like sub parallelisms between the or within the main elements in common. And so the well-known stories for probably your classics interest audience about Circe, the Sirens, Calypso, Nausicaa, all of these stories have elements in common with sub-stories also coming from the Mahabharata. This author, Nicholas Allen, finds 30 something parallelisms between these two stories. Now, what's interesting to me is that these two scholars come to almost antithetical conclusions when they pursue these comparative endeavors. For Fernando Wolf Alonso, the only logical explanation is that one culture influenced the other. For Nicholas Allen, the only corollary possible after thinking and pondering about this is that since both the Greco-Roman world and India have this Indo-European shared heritage dating back hundreds, even thousands of years, so this must have been something that evolved within each culture and eventually it manifests itself into different texts. Mm, each author presents their answer as the definitive one and other possibilities as something that you should consider but eventually disregard because the only logical one is the one they posit. My view of this is that when you compare, you can almost exclude the lucky coincidence option, although never completely. And you should work more in terms of probability than in terms of proving or disproving. You have to keep an open mind about these subjects. And this is what I try to do in the book. I am working under the premise that some of these elements could be better explained in terms of cultural context, and I try to present the evidence that would support that claim. But I am not claiming to have proven anything that wasn't maybe that wasn't even said or considered before. Some things are new. There's always something new to a book. Otherwise, it wouldn't be worth even writing. But even those things, I am not absolutely well. I might be like convinced in terms of myself, but in terms of presenting it to the academic community or to the public in general, it's just like here's the evidence. These are the things that these two sort sets of texts share, and well, look at them, consider them, and think about it in terms of this possibility of a cultural contact.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's hard to be certain about anything when talking about the ancient world. So it's probably a safe position to take, but it is a little tricky because we humans are pattern seekers. So it makes sense that when looking at different texts that we would want to find parallels and that, there are so many that exist that we can draw in like, oh, how many heroes are born of virgin mothers, how many of them get cuts on the side, how many, like there's the Trinity and many things. I mean, there's so many that you almost wonder if they're just part of some sort of universal experience, with regards to motherhood, fertility, these kind of things that kind of reappear over and over again. Or as you mentioned, some sort of historical event like the idea of the Great Flood shows up again and again. So I suppose to get back to the specifics of Greco-Roman and Indian cross-cultural exchange, when did this sort of take place? Because, I mean, you were referencing, the Odyssey and the Iliad, like this is 8th century. I mean, how far back does it go, basically?
So the beginning of the exchange is kind of a tricky question because you can find commonalities between the Upanishads, which are later Vedic texts, so very ancient literature from ancient India, and the dialogues of Plato, for instance, or any other philosophers, which is the subject that you were bringing up. Some studies surrounding this have been carried out. I particularly like Richard Seyffert's book about these similarities between the philosophy, the Greek philosophy and Indian philosophy. But his answer to the question is not entirely to my satisfaction, because it's this idea of similar cultural context end up giving similar products. So a little bit of this, we as humans tend to think in the same ways and create the same metaphors, which is not entirely untrue, but it's, to me, it's not enough. When the similarities are too numerous, maybe two, three, four, five things could have been a coincidence. We as humans tend to think of up and down, day and night, and these antithetical ways of thinking and basic structures when articulating language. But several details within one same narrative, and especially if these are short narratives. One of the texts I work with is this famous passage from the Odyssey about Polyphemus the Cyclops, and within a couple hundred verses you can find lots of shared elements with Sanskrit texts, and when you find this, so there is this idea that there might be something else to it. And to get back to your question, the sets of texts that I have selected are very intentional in this way. I am working with literature that definitely and without any significant doubt is older in the Greco-Roman world than it is in India. And both sets of texts, I'm talking about the epic and the theater, when they first arise in the Indian subcontinent, is after Alexander's campaign to India. So in these two literary genres, epic and theater, we are considering the fourth, third century BCE as this key point. And this is why I am working only under the assumption of this one directional uh, procedure of influences and borrowings. This is never to say or to assume that there wasn't Indian influence in in Greece, or even in Rome for that matter. But at the time, I still haven't been able to figure out how to approach the influence in the other direction. Maybe this will be a future project, or this would be something that someone else can undertake.
So let's get into the specifics a bit then. You mentioned the Cyclops. How do we see the influence of the Cyclops then into epic poetry in India?
Yeah, so when you think of the Cyclops, probably to a Western audience, the first thing that would come to mind would be the one eye, the single eye in the middle of the forehead. This this wasn't even this way in all of ancient Greece, but that's a whole other subject. Here I am taking this Cyclops in this broader sense of an ogre, a giant creature who's a man-eater, who's an obstacle to the hero during his journey, who lives like isolated, has some sort of equals living around him, but he still likes more this lonely wolf lifestyle. He ends up killing some people related to the hero, and the hero has to depend on their fortitude as well as on this other side of intelligence or acuity or something like that to trick the ogre in the end. And after their encounter, there is some sort of notion of freedom, be it for the hero himself or for other people that benefit from it. And all of these elements you can find in the Odyssey, and in the Odyssey for sure, in the satyr drama Cyclops by Euripides as well. And when you go to the Indian side, there are three main stories about ogre-like characters. They are called Rakshasas in the Sanskrit narrative. They are also like big creatures. They are also characterized as being man-eaters, and they have a sweet tooth for human flesh. This is the Sanskrit texts are very insistent on this idea. They tend to annoy priests when they are carrying out their priestly functions, or in the middle of a ritual, a rakshasa would come and impede the procedure. They also kind of live in isolated spaces. There are also differences to it. So, for instance, a Rakshasa has two eyes, and while the Cyclops lives in an island, or is related to this island of the goats, and the land that is in front of it, the Rakshasas live in the middle of the forest. So there are lots of common elements. There are also some significant, in some cases, differences. But when you look at all this evidence, there are point to point similarities sometimes in the phrasing, the same epithets, the same adjectives, the same verbs used for the description. One of the main elements is this idea that what the hero has to carry to defeat the ogre was some sort of gift related to a priest. I'm talking about Odysseus and the wine, and it was given by this priest of Apollo. So you have a priest and his family, and they give food for the Sanskrit hero to take to the ogre as well. So this little bits and pieces keep on piling on, and there is this article, an academic article, 2005 or 6, around those years, by Emily West, which compares these Rakshasa narratives from the Mahabharata. I mentioned before there were three of them. These are the stories of Hidimba, Baka, and Kirmira. These are the names of the Sanskrit Rakshasas. And on the other side, you have this Polyphemus story. Once again, this paper by Emily West defends the idea of an Indo-European origin, and I take some of her findings, I interpret them in a different light from this perspective that I am bringing to the table, and my point of view is that you can better understand them in terms of this cultural context. In reality, what would most likely be the answer for all these questions is that some of these elements are Indo-European, and some of these elements are due to cultural contact, and eventually some are due to human patterns of thinking as well.
Okay, I have to ask just as an aside, when did the Cyclops get just one eye? Just out of curiosity. Did he start off with two eyes and then become one-eyed, or is there like a moment when that change happened?
I'm thinking there is a book about this subject. I cannot pinpoint the author or the title at the time, but you have Cyclopes since Hesiod, and you have also this Cyclops in the Iliad, but yeah, I'm not sure about the first mention of the one-eyed Cyclops, but from the Hellenistic period onwards, it's just a one-eyed Cyclops. So
I just always find that
you could look
fascinating to
into that.
see
Yeah, yeah.
how these evolve and change. But to get back on track, with regards to, say, something like these large ogres who are man-eaters, I mean, is there ever just a possibility of just a bit of historicity to it, that there was in contact with some, I don't know, large population of South Pacific cannibals or something? I don't know, that, like, I mean, at different times do we take these myths and these stories, and we question them, but every now and then we do find a little element of history deep within these sort of oral traditions. Is it possible, like a Great Flood type story that people will often bring up again, is it possible that some of these elements came from interaction with the same groups of people, or there was some element of prehistory that caused that same myth?
It could be. My answer to the question of is it possible, I think it will always remain yes, it's possible that there is this background to it. I have looked into Humbaba, for instance, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and there are a lot of commonalities as well with these ogre stories. But I insist that the idea, or the main argument in favor of this hypothesis is the detail. As with many things, that's where the devil is. So for instance, this famous scene of Odysseus pretending to be nobody, and then not being able to refrain himself and shouting out to the Cyclops, I am Odysseus. So there's this passage in the Sanskrit narrative where the two of them are fighting, and out of nowhere, the text mentions that the hero screams, trumpets his name. Why would he do that? And the explanation, this is not a common occurrence in other instances of fighting with rakshasas. This is also not something that Sanskrit heroes tend to do when they fight. We have a huge corpus of epic Sanskrit literature. The Mahabharata is about 10 times the Iliad and the Odyssey combined. So this is the size of the texts that we are working with. And this particular weird, odd, bizarre instance of the hero shouting his name, it could be explained in terms of, oh, if there are these 10, 11, 12 elements that the two narratives share, and there is this very famous feature of one of the narratives, then it could be possible that you should like imagine this ancient workshop of cultural exchange, and some author who has read and knows and remembers some of these passages and is creating a new literature, much like in terms of what modern literary criticism calls classical tradition. So you have these European authors looking into the classics, and you can imagine in the ancient world these Indian authors having, knowing, and recreating these Greco-Roman classics. And oh yeah, this is the famous passage about him shouting his name. So the hero shouts his name, and it ends up being a bizarre feature in the Sanskrit epic. This is one of the arguments advanced by Fernando Wolf Alonso in his proposal in surrounding methodological considerations about the cultural contact theory. When an element is widely familiar between two cultures, then there's probably not much to it. When you have an element that is weird in one side and it's run to the mill, common in the other, then you probably should consider the idea that in this context, if other elements were borrowed, then this borrowing would make more sense in this context of borrowing.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Can I ask then, I mean, we've seen, as you mentioned, a lot of the influence from the Romans, the Greco-Romans onto to the Indians. Were there influences the other way around? I mean, that we could see in theater and art?
There should have been. When we look at commerce, this is the main field. When you look at the exchanges between the Roman Empire and what would have been by the time the Kushan Empire in northern India. So there's obviously spices from India, animals, slaves, non-precious metals, woods, gemstones, and the list goes on and on about things Indian coming to Rome. In terms of literature, there should have been some influences as well. By the time you have, as you mentioned, the novel, the romance in Rome. Um, there have been studies linking the Roman romances to Hellenistic romances, for instance, Longo that you mentioned, and others as well. A field in which this sort of India to the Greco-Roman world influence could have also happened is the fable. This is a quite complex set of texts because you have Aesop in Greece, and then you have this like Aesopic tradition leading towards Phaedrus and Babrius and other Roman authors, and you have Sanskrit collections, some of which are around a couple of centuries CE, some of which are, we are talking Middle Ages in the West, maybe 11th, 12th century CE. So the dating is always the problem when you try and prove India to Greece or India to the Greco-Roman world influence, because there is very little that is factually known about the dates of Sanskrit literature in general. Sanskritists or Indologists often speak in terms of a terminus antequem and postquem, so a couple of centuries from the second to the fourth CE, and that is quite broad when you're used to the Greco-Roman world and Roman calendars, where you even have the day of the month when something happened. So you have to account for that. Uh, the the fable, for instance, some authors, this Spanish classicist Francisco Rodriguez Adrados, has proposed the idea of a Greco-Roman influence in Sanskrit fables. Uday Prakash Arora, whom I mentioned before, he contends the other directionality. So India first, and then the Greco-Roman world. In some of these subjects, we have more certainties, and this is why I have chosen the epic and the theater, as I mentioned before.
No, it's very fascinating. And you say there's so much knowledge that has been lost and so many works that sadly haven't made it through time. If there was a text that you wish would resurface that would help explain those correlations, which text would that be? Has there been any ones that have been hinted at that you think would be helpful that you wish didn't burn down in the Library of Alexandria or something?
Much of the literature that could have had a direct and resounding impact on this sort of hypothesis is or would have been found in modern day Afghanistan. So there's this ancient city of Ai Kanun, which was excavated in the 1970s, and they found the building of a Greek theater there. And in the walls of what remains of this building, you have like the imprint of some texts of some manuscripts that were used for the creation of the brick wall, and there are some fragments of Greek theater. And modern day Afghanistan is old days India. Ancient India included, well, Pakistan and Afghanistan and a whole broader region that what we identify as modern day India. Mm, we have also references to at least four uh, dramatic festivals. I'm not sure if the term would be maybe too broad to call them that, but four dramatic representations to four stagings of Greek plays during Alexander's expedition, and as we know, Alexander made it all the way to India. So if we think about this region, and if it were possible to find new texts, new manuscripts, new elements of Greek examples of Greek plays, and probably the most decisive factor would be something Roman, some sort of mention reference to Roman texts that would very much help this hypothesis.
Well, thank you so much, Roberto. I'm going to finish up with just one last question because here at Classical Wisdom, we always try to sort of show the relevancy of these ancient texts and the pursuit of history and knowledge in sort of a modern light. So what would this cultural exchange mean for us today? What would you say is the relevancy of kind of understanding this cross-culturalism?
Well, in the light of some of the new findings that we've had this past maybe a century, but even during these last few years. So we have found Indian figurines in Pompeii. We have Heracles helping out the Buddha in northern India. A couple of years ago, this is maybe 2020, 2022 or something like that, we have the Berenike Buddha, a sculpture of this Indian figure of Buddha in Berenike in Egypt. So probably if we were to accept this and try and understand these ancient cultures not in terms of chapters of the history book or chapters of the literatures of the ancient world, but in terms of a whole, thinking of the ancient world as a whole, we would probably have to redefine our modern notion of globalization. Some of these authors that I have mentioned today have already spoke about it in these terms. What we have in these years around the turn of the millennium is what we could very well call the first globalization. So this is only Eurasia and a bit of Northern Africa, but it's a whole lot of the world that was known by the time. Speaking of as someone coming from America, from the American continent, so this would not include us yet, but at least there is a whole section of the world that would have been and could have been interacting by this time. And what is most fascinating, I believe, is that if you take subjects like these fables, which we have in modern day in Europe, for instance, and you go back in time, uh, people would probably know that they made it through Spain, coming from the Arab world, and before them from Persia, and before them from India. And if you could go still back in time to the Greco-Roman world and maybe to Mesopotamia, which we mentioned before, wouldn't it be wonderful to kind of trace this outsketch of a global history of ideas, of a global view of literature and influences coming back and forth from one culture to another, all in terms of this huge contribution to mankind. I think it would be wonderful.
Well, I can't think of a better spot to stop. Thank you so much with those final words. It was fantastic. And I will put a link down for your book as well, so everyone can check it out if they want to learn more and discover more of those parallels. So thank you so much, Roberto, for taking the time to speak with me today.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks, a podcast dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds.